Right, good morning everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Just kind of a bit of continuity from yesterday. One of the things that is very easy to overlook is that when you're looking at important thinkers and their contribution, quite often the problem they leave behind is as important as the problems they try to solve. So if you go back to yesterday on the discussion on Kant, in many respects what Kant has done is to pose the what he sees as almost like an insurmountable sort of difference between is and ought, what is and what ought to occur. He leaves that to us. I don't think he particularly resolves it. It's a problem that moral thinking needs to engage with in all of its different kind of dimensions. And I think similar with Marx. I think Marx looks at a question in a lot of detail, and he kind of looks at the dialectical relation between the particular and the universal, but also between subject and object, and between freedom and determinism. And he poses those issues in an extremely clear, sort of concise kind of a way. But as I shall go on to suggest, there are some problems with that is left for future generations to deal with. I find discussing Marx really difficult in an academic, intellectual environment for the very simple reason that there is a vast corpus of material that's been written about Marx over the last 100 years. And I find that the vast majority of that material about Marx really says much more about the writers' agendas and their own intellectual interests than about what Marx himself was trying to do and about Marx's place within the body of thinking that he evolves in the early 19th century and becomes part and parcel of that very last phase of the historical Enlightenment. And I think that when you approach Marx through this body of work, it's very easy to get the wrong end of the stick, to the point at which some of the most basic concepts that people use in relation to Marx are actually far more troublesome. For example, yesterday, people talked about the social, and there's an implication that somehow Marx represents the social, as opposed to others who represent the individual, which is actually totally alien to Marx's own thinking. I think, if there's one thing I like to do before I drop dead, is to begin to interrogate very, very seriously the status of the social, the concept of the social. Because I actually think, when you probe the concept more and more deeply, it has a very ahistorical and ultimately a kind of very undialectical character to it, which increasingly in our time becomes a weapon with which to beat subjectivity and the role of the individual, and that's its main accomplishment to the work of the last 100 years. But let's go back to my starting. My starting point in this is my own journey, which in a roundabout way approaches Marx through what went on before him and what happened at his time, rather than the way we think of it now. One of the things I tried to do, there was a time in my life when I looked at Marx, immersed myself in his work, and thought that I had mastered it. Being modest, sort of. And then I decided to go back to the beginning of intellect, certainly Western intellectual thought, and kind of gone back through the experience of the previous 200 years to really see where he is. And from that, what I've tried to do is to extract what I see as being his contribution for his time, his legacy for now, in a positive sense, and also his limitations for our own lives. Now, Karl Popper, in his The Open Society and Its Enemies, offers a very interesting critique of what he characterizes as Marx's sociological determinism. I think it's interesting to read Popper because the classical misreading of what Marx is really all about. But in places, he gets close to it. But what Popper basically does with Marx is he recognizes some of Marx's merits, but in the end he dismisses him as a false prophet. I mean, the expression false prophet is quite often used in relation to him. And he says, Popper insists, that Marx was a prophet of the course of history, who was dominated by the idea of inexorable laws of nature and historical development. And you will find that there are numerous texts being written where the idea of Marx and inexorable laws are closely intertwined. I mean, it's almost taken as a premise that Marx, yes, inexorable laws, that's really what he's saying about the whole course of history. And Popper, who is an opponent of historicism, describes Marxism as the purest historicism of all. Now, although I would suggest that Popper misunderstood Marx's theory of history, his use of the term purist historicism is one that actually comes quite close to grasping one of the central features of Marx's theory, which I think is a very powerful disposition towards temporality. I think Marx is really quite unique in that he, of anybody in the 19th century, and I would suggest before him, has this incredible sense of temporality, which is saturated through his work. And that's something that's been, in a sense, totally, I suggest, missed out, except by a couple of people, in the subsequent interpretation of its work. Now, whatever historicism means, and we can have a discussion about how to define historicism. I mean, there are different ways of defining it. Marx's own version certainly did not fall into the mechanical reductionist and theological conceptions that Popper criticized. And therefore, you will never find within Marx himself anything that even remotely comes close to the idea of inexorable laws of historical destiny. Now, of course, Popper's criticism of historical destiny are well-founded. And the tradition of theological historical theorization is a very powerful one in the 19th century, but not in relation to Marx. I just want to go through the whole sort of way that this issue has evolved. As we all know, since the Greeks, human development and change has tended to be interpreted as the outcome of some kind of suprahuman agency, some kind of divine providence that works behind the back of human beings and makes history happen, some kind of central sort of content to history that's gradually unfolding and is being revealed to us through some kind of ahistorical agency. So, for example, according to St. Augustine, who authored possibly the greatest religiously inspired philosophy of history, says, in the torrential stream of human history, two currents meet and mix. The current of evil, which flows from Adam, and that of good, which comes from God. There's a kind of very clear sense of divine intervention, of historical sort of providence, divine providence working itself out. Now, I would suggest that one of the problems with this interpretation of history is that the central status that's assigned to divine providence in explaining historical development invariably finds a very undistinguished role for the notion of a genuine humanly historical subjectivity. In all of these histories, we are a bit like Hollywood extras, sort of bit players who kind of serve as agencies to which something more powerful is being realized and gains definition. In contrast to this, what Marx tried to do, based very much on the legacy that went before it, the legacy of the Enlightenment, particularly the contribution of Vico and Hegel, was to develop an idea which elsewhere I call historical thinking or historical consciousness. which is centered around two ideas, two important ideas. One is the idea of genesis, transience, and cumulative development being a feature of historical movement. One which sees change and within change mutations occurring and evolving through time. And secondly, what he puts forward more systematically than any other thinker is a humanized conception of historical agency. I don't think that even Marx is able, because of his time, to go all the way down that road of humanizing agency and of allowing subjectivity to take its own course. And I leave open the question of whether history ends with Marx's sort of theory in the way that he outlines it, or doesn't, because I think it's an important question. Or where is history going is something that we're asking all the time, and all the 18th, 19th century theoreticians had very important ideas about it. So I'll come back to that point a bit later on. But what Marx did was he very forcefully elaborated the logic immanent in historical thinking. I mean, there's, no matter what you read about Marx, if you actually read his own writings, there can be no doubt about what he meant. He might disagree with it, but there is no doubt about what he actually argues. And when it comes to historical thinking, what he says, it's very, very clear. He says, history does nothing. History does nothing. He says it possesses no immense wealth. It wages no battles. It is man, real living man, who does all that, who possesses and fights. History, in inverted commas, is not, as it were, a person apart, using man as a means to achieve its own aims. History is nothing but the activity of man pursuing his aims. So that couldn't be clearer than that. You might not agree with him, but he's very, very clear that there is no history over there that is external to human subjectivity. There is no history either. There's no inexorable laws. There is no, sort of supra-human agency that's got some kind of agenda. It is man, he says, real man, pursuing their aims. That is what history is all about. So when Marx says that history does nothing, he's alluding to a human-centered conception of change and development. Now, there are a lot of people in this room, like myself, who are very comfortable with the idea of a human-centered conception of change and development. But out there in the real world, that is a very frightening conception. People find it very difficult to accept and to embrace the idea that at the end of the day, it's not his logic up there, it's not some natural evolutionary process, it's not our genes or biology, but it's human subjectivity that actually bears 110% responsibility for all of what happened and what is to be. Which is why there is such hostility, and even hostility that almost verges on hatred in contemporary philosophical discussions against a human-centered conception of social or philosophical theory. Now, Marx was by no means the first person to couple history with the role of human agency. He really wasn't the first person. And in fact, probably the earliest, clearest expression of this kind of thinking can be found in the writing of Giambattista Vico, a philosopher from Naples, who first appeared to grasp the point when he wrote in his The New Science the following. He said, and this is in already the 18th century, early 18th century, so you can see it's not a novel idea. He said that the world of civil society has certainly been made by men, and that its principles are therefore to be found within the modification of the human mind. So it's the modification of the human mind and the world of and the world of men that is responsible for our society. Now what Vico did, and in that sense he was a man of his time, he said, he understood that the historical processes could not be entirely explained by the acts of specific individuals who pursue their subjective objectives. He understood that the outcomes produced are often unintended, that we set in motion certain acts whose consequences are not as we intended. We cannot predict what happens because of that. And quite often, as Vico himself said, they could be diametrically opposed to our original intentions. And I'm sure that you yourself in your lives have quite often done things with a particularly clear intent. I know I've done it far more often than I can admit. And woke up and realized that I achieved the very opposite of what I set out to do. And we do that on a minor, undistinguished individual scale. We do it, sort of in a society as a whole. And in a sense, when Vico came up with this, when he realized that actually there is this, there are these outcomes that are somehow at variance with intent, with subjective intent, what he did was, what more or less everybody else did, was he kind of reintroduced externally a trans-historical idea of providence. And basically argued that there is this kind of idea of providence that works behind and the designs of men. And in a sense, what Vico did, and in that sense wasn't that different, is having been forced to come up against the limits of subjectivity, kind of fall back upon, well, maybe there is a providential design somewhere that also needs to be taken into account. But Vico had in fact pointed to an important question, which also concerned Marx, which is the relationship between human intent and the outcome of history. Probably the single most important question in the 21st century. The relationship between intent and outcome in the making of history. Now you all know Marx's very famous saying on this, his aphorism, but have you ever actually thought about it, and dwelt on it, and tried to sort of think through its implications? When he says, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. It's really pointing to something that, whether we like it or not, whether we're explicit or implicit about it, we're kind of dwelling and dealing with all of the time. So the question that immediately comes up is, not just simply the relationship between history and subjectivity, but, for example, who or what determines or influences or shapes human behavior, if there is any kind of determination. I just want to say a couple of things on this, because it is again one of those totally misunderstood elements of Marxist theory. I don't know if any had a chance to read my introduction to the Jakubowski book, but I think certainly from the argument I put forward and using some of Marx's material, the base superstructure discussion is not particularly useful. The fact that there's a base which determines superstructure is really an idiot's, a simpleton's version of Marx. That is, again, it's a way of almost misconstruing the elements of what's being argued there. Now he does, of course, Marx argues that social existence, and he uses the term social existence, determines human consciousness. And it's the point that he makes in a couple of his passages. But I think it's important to realize that the way that he uses the term determinism is not one that should be confused with the concept of causality. Determination and determinant, and it's a plural in his usage of the term, determinant, it's not determinant, is not the same as causality. It doesn't imply a causal relationship. And certainly the idea that the economy determines political and cultural life is a fairly superficial interpretation, for the very simple reason that there is no fixed relationship. I mean, if you take the idea of determinism as kind of in the way that he uses it, it implicitly suggests there is no fixed relationship between the different layers and the different concepts of his analysis. And in any case, what is existence, what constitutes social existence, is itself not the same thing as either material reality or the economy. I mean, social existence is not something that is exhausted by these two specific characteristics. And in fact, what he suggests, what Marx suggests, is that the circumstances, or determinate circumstances, which exist are subject to historical variations and variability. And I'm often astounded that this is something that is almost totally missing from the literature, because the really interesting idea that he puts forward isn't base determining the superstructure, but the fact that there are determinate moments in human history through which the relationship between subject and object is mediated. I think that's the exciting thing. And therefore, if the relationship of mediation between subject and object is susceptible to variations, to historical variations, that leaves open the question of discovering what those are. And we know, for example, when he writes in Volume 3 of Capital, he makes the point about how in ancient Rome it was politics, and in the Middle Ages it was Catholicism that reigned supreme. He doesn't say that in ancient Rome it was a slave economy, right? And he doesn't say that in medieval Europe it was just serf economy. But he also basically makes the point that there are moments when these, what we now call ideological factors, acquired commanding influence. And he uses the word commanding influence to describe those things. And in Engels' writings, we know, for example, the role that he attached, the significance that he attached to force and to military organization in certain historical circumstances. Where the confusion lies is that Marx's critique of political economy, not his economics, but he wasn't an economist, he was actually a critique of political economy, was relevant to a particular historical moment in time. He didn't write a critique of Roman political economy, because there was no political economy in Rome. Right? He wrote a critique of political economy because at his lifetime, it was political economy, particularly in its Scottish form, that for him represented the most interesting and the clearest expressions of what he took to be fundamental relationships within society. Right? So always remember his sense of temporality, which if you take away from it, does turn Marxism into a manual for idiots, rather than for anything more interesting than that. So there's no kind of fixed relationship. And in fact, what's interesting when you're looking at kind of Marx, his writings, is that the criticism that is made of Marx by Popper and people like that are actually quite accurate, but not about him, but about virtually everybody else that was writing in the 19th century. If you will recall, what happens in the 19th century is that there is a fundamental reaction against the 18th century, what's called 18th century rationalism. A reaction against the upheavals that are put in place by the French Revolution. You will find that one of the most distinct focus that this reaction takes is and this is in Burke, in England. It will be in Bonald and Demestre in France. What this reaction is this incredible sense that through the application of reason, individuals have been restrained from their traditional links and ties, that the French Revolution has destabilized communities, undermined tradition and religion, and therefore what you have is this new force coming to the fore, what is perceived and feared as the atomized individual. The atomized individual, actually, a lot of so-called Marxist writers, when they talk about this period, make the mistake of imagining that what the reaction was against the new working class emerging. The new working class hasn't emerged at that point. It doesn't exist. What this reaction is a reaction to the threat of individualism. I mean, Burke's writing is really about people who are entirely naked on their own as against the world. And if you read, for example, French Catholic, reactionary Catholic writing, it's all about the threat that the individual poses. It's all about what the individual represents. How do you combat the individual? What do you do in the 19th century? What kind of intellectual weapons are at your disposal in the 19th century? What de Maistre and Bonald would like to do is to bring back Catholicism, right? Medieval Catholicism, and they write about medieval Catholicism, where everything was clear and certain, where there's clear hierarchy, and there was stability and tradition. The trouble is they're all intelligent enough to understand that you cannot bring back medieval Catholicism. If you do, it becomes a caricature of itself. You cannot do that. So what do you do if you cannot bring back Catholicism? You bring back society. And it's at this point that the social emerges as a provisional solution through which the community can be recast in a more rational, modern form. It's in the 19th century that all of a sudden society emerges as this answer to the problem of order. That somehow, it is society itself that determines our lives and ought to have the authority to gain obedience from us. And you have different versions of the argument. If you take the most sophisticated version, which is Scottish political economy, they insist that what society does is through the spontaneous interaction of people on the market, order is enacted. You now have an order and stable existence. And somehow, although Adam Smith and Ferguson and some of the other great thinkers understand that there's more to it than just simply the invisible hand, nevertheless, through the impersonal forces of society, order is almost spontaneously reenacted. And you have people like in France, the Saint-Simon and Comte, these new sociologists who are often seen as kind of being totally against the conservatives, going about and almost turning society into religion. I mean, Saint-Simon actually made a religion. They were all atheists. They were very similar to the new atheists around now, the Dawkins of this world. But they all wanted to make their atheism into a new religion through which they could gain new kinds of obedience. That's what Comte and Saint-Simon are doing. This is really their kind of project. So at this point in time, society does become, and the social does become, a kind of trans-historical, all-purpose answer and solution to the problem of mankind. And I think it's important to remember this because today, we, especially progressive people, have a historical amnesia about where the word social and the term social and society comes from. Which is why, unfortunately, in a very perverse kind of a way, it's become very fashionable to uphold the social and to see the individual as the problem. And that's the way that it's kind of evolved, where individualism is seen as this incredible, corrosive force that undermines society. I don't know if any of you do social sciences, but if you look at, for example, the writings of Simmel in Germany, or you look at the writings of Durkheim in France, what do they say? Durkheim says that sociology is the study of social facts. And these social facts have got this inexorable power, this almost semi-coercive power to gain order and stability. Right? You normalize social order through the workings of society. And that's really how it occurs. I should say that, you know, there is a kind of interesting side to this, which is by emphasizing the social, which is what happened in the 19th century, what you do in effect is you, almost in a Sartre bad faith kind of a way, avoid the political. Right? Because authority is not entirely social, but the political, which is a much trickier area, you know, where you cannot simply say in politics everything is fine, everything is resolved. You avoid the political. And one of the things that I've learned in my recent studies, I was actually quite surprised and, you know, really felt like kicking myself, you know, how stupid you can be. Because when you look at the 19th century, most of the 19th century, there is virtually no political theory. I mean, political theory goes into retirement in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, really, when you think about political theory, it's feeble. It is, you know, we don't have, you know, the kind of ambitious attempts or the kind of more philosophical attempts. That political theory goes into hibernation. And you look at England and you got these, you know, really undistinguished characters like P.H. Green and, you know, all these people sort of messing around at the margins. But the big issues, I mean, you know, after Hegel, you know, sort of, there is very little of that left. And that's what you have instead is all that intellectual energy going into other disciplines, other domains of experience. Now, Marx himself, you know, sort of was also involved in this. He was very much an individual that was influenced by precisely the same kind of trend. He was no less influenced by these new conceptions of society that were emerging than anywhere else. But what he tried to do, I think where he was a little bit different, is that he was aware of the political dimension that needed to be taken into account. And what he tried to do was to develop a conception of domination that wasn't reducible to the social domination ideas that were in evidence in the 19th century, but was based upon his idea of the separation of economic from the political. I think in that sense he kind of continued an idea that began with classical political economy, where, you know, I mean, if you look at the, from Hume onwards, there is a kind of sense that politics and economics are, you know, slightly different, and there's a disposition towards seeing the autonomization of the political sphere. What Marx does, he takes that forward a little bit. And what he does is that he develops an idea that the separation of the economic from the political creates a form of compulsion that obscures the social character of domination. He says that this occurs because property in the form of capital acquires an independent form, where its material properties become evident, not its relationship to labor, and its material properties appear as its distinctive character. And he says, in this way, the social actions take the form of objects which rule the producers of being ruled by them. You know, this is where he begins to develop his idea of commodity fetishism, for example, where he talks about the way in which the autonomization of the political, creating this distinct sphere of economics where domination takes place through the market, obscures the relations of power. And his commodity fetishism idea is really quite important, because basically what he is suggesting is that it kind of creates a kind of a perception that it's not the human person that is responsible for what is taking place, but almost the things that are created, produced through capital. And this is the point at which he talks about the way that inanimate objects almost take on a human form. And, you know, if you listen to the discussion on the banking crisis today, you will see that we talk about money talks. You know, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've never seen a pound coin talk to me yet. Maybe sometimes in my fantasy. Or whenever I listen to the Today program, you often get a banker come on and say, the financial markets say, and there's a kind of idea that somehow these invisible forces are just kind of talking to us, and in that conception of the way that impersonal forces working behind our backs dominates us is really subtly developed within Marxist sociology, where he basically makes the point that the thing about capital is that it very rarely appears what it really is, which is a relation of domination. Now, Marx's representation of the spontaneous reproduction of social relations can be seen as a development of the arguments advanced by 18th and early 19th century political economy. So Scottish political economists like Adam Smith and liberal utilitarian thinkers frequently claim that the pursuit of individual interests would lead to the spontaneous formation of order. And the big difference between them and Marx is that is the way this kind of pursuit of individual interests was interpreted. Because what Marx argues is that actually the pursuit of interest by individuals is rarely free and is rarely voluntary. And that kind of relates to his wider theory of the subjectification of individuals to capital. Now, there is within the construction of these impersonal forces that dominate our lives within a market economy, a potentially deterministic epistemology that's kind of contained within that. And you could argue that Marx's theory of capital and its epistemological assumptions are not dissimilar to that of the social theorists of the same time. That there's a certain kind of similarity between them. And you could even argue that possibly in his discussion of the modern fetishism and its impact on the human imagination, he may have gone down a little bit too far on the road towards social determinism. But I think, however we see that, what distinguishes his theorization is his introduction of the history-making potential of human subjectivity. And this is really where there is a major rupture between what he's doing and what other people are doing. And it's interesting, and one of the things I find quite interesting reading this, I completely forgot about this, but I was preparing for a lecture that Elliot is giving. Where's Elliot?
Yeah.
Right here. On social Darwinism. And one of the things I've been doing in my writing is kind of saying, well, Marx has got 40 volumes of his collected works. There are very few people that have read the 40 volumes. Who's read the 40 volumes? Right? I mean, that's an impossibility. And occasionally, one of the things I've been doing recently is, like I was writing a chapter of a book on Augustus and the Roman Empire, and I said to myself, did Marx ever say anything about him? So I kind of, with Google now, it's very easy to kind of find out, Augustus, Marx, you put it in, and you get the collected work, whatever. And sure enough, I get to his gymnasium matriculation, where he writes an essay at the age of 18 about Augustus, and you realize that he did say, well, I said to myself, did he say anything about social Darwinism? Because social Darwinism is actually the most deterministic of the social theory of the 19th century. And I kind of was interested to see, how what kind of conversation did he have with the social Darwinist? I mean, one of the things about great philosophers is that they have these internal conversations with people that they never meet. That's how you develop your ideas. And sure enough, he did have something to say about social Darwinism. It says,
what you told me.
What?
That wasn't what you told me.
You were
You said read English.
No. It's only 2 lines. And that was before I discovered Google. So I'm one of those latecomers to the internet. And basically he was kind of fascinated by these social Darwinist theories of history and society, and he basically criticized their intellectual, he used the word, their intellectual laziness. And he basically said, and dismissed their views, that all history must be subsumed in one single great natural law. a very simple point. Isn't it really intellectually lazy that you guys try to reduce all of human history into this one law of evolution, which I thought was quite interesting, and it really, sort of indicates his attempt to break from teleology. And he then goes on to, there's two more sentences instead of he said, and he criticized them for objectifying history and for expelling subjectivity. And he says, so from the social Darwinist point of view, life appears as non-historical, while the historical appears as something separated from ordinary life, something extra super-terrestrial. A very, very clear statement. So, anybody that reads his account of social Darwinism would have been no doubt where he stands in relation to the charge of historicism. And that becomes quite an important point, because precisely the same time that Marx said this, sort of in a letter, in the United States, the emerging discipline of sociology was saying, not almost, but entirely the opposite. So, for example, Albion Small, who nobody's ever heard of, except me and two of my friends, he was the founder of the first department of sociology in the United States, in the University of Chicago. In the very first article in the American Journal of Sociology, the very first article, written in the very first volume of this journal, called The Era of Sociology, where he kind of outlines the program for this new kind of discipline, sort of justifies it in these terms. Just listen to this, because it gives you a sense of, the kind of the dialectic in terms of ideas that occurs at that time. He says, modern thought assumes that the fixed factors in human conditions are insignificant as compared with the elements that may be determined by agreement. It goes on, popular judgment is just now intoxicated with the splendid half-truth that society is what men choose to make it. Half-truth. When were human beings intoxicated with this idea? I don't know. But he's making a polemical point, right? Splendid half-truth that society is what men choose to make it. And he then goes on and says, and indicts popular philosophy for its speculations about institutional rearrangement without due estimation of human limitations. That's the charge. Sociology and social theory in its modern form begins its career by reminding us time and time again about our human limitations. It's what I call the theory of grandmoms, better safe than sorry, just kind of hold back a little bit. And that's really what it is. And that's, and you got to remember this is the same moment, historical moment, when Marx is criticizing social Darwinism for its silliness and reducing everything to one law. Now, Marx's response to Small, if they had known each other, would have been that that society is not what man choose to make it. It's what man means by it. And what's really important in this isn't just simply the making of society or the limitations about it, but the meaning you give to it. And at this point, we come to what is the subject of this whole discussion in this academy, which is the role of freedom. Now, it was Hegel. I'm not going to go very much longer, so don't worry. I'm not going to go into Hegel in great detail. But it was Hegel who gave an account of history as the realization of the idea of freedom. I reread Hegel recently, particularly his little history book, and it is fantastic. I don't know why I didn't get so much out of it, when I was in my youth. But it's quite a monumental achievement, the way that, for his time, he kind of manages to see freedom at work as an important element in history. So he talks about it as being the realization of the idea of freedom. And he saw history as a forward movement in which the idea of freedom would gain greater meaning. And we can discuss and debate what is meant by the idea of freedom, because that is an open question. But unfortunately, Hegel was very reluctant, and understandably very reluctant, as Vico was sometime before him, to project the forward momentum of history and to run with it. And therefore he ended up with an apologetic closure of historical development and its alleged climax in the European civilization of the Germanic world. So with him, with the Prussian state and German civilization, history kind of comes to an end. And the reason for that was because Hegel, for all his philosophical subtleties, could not conceptualize history as being irrepressibly open. That was not something that was possible in his day. Now, in contrast, Marx did not foreclose the possibility that historical development would continue. But I think that Marx, too, was to some extent the product of his time. And although, unlike Hegel, he didn't formally announce the end of history, that's not something that he explicitly did. Because he was a product of his era, he tended to project into the future the problems and solutions of his own time. And therefore, in that sense, he saw the possibility of the idea of freedom, something that's specifically an emancipation from necessity, as being realized in the future. I think in the 19th century, if you had a humanist disposition, if you were drawn toward a subjective interpretation of history, it was very difficult not to see the realization of freedom as something that could be done, that could be almost solidified. He himself doesn't do that, but in a sense what he does is he, at this point, reintroduces a kind of teleology into his theory, which is the realization of freedom through communism. He kind of brings that in, but actually, I would suggest, if you look at his theory, what he's really doing is a bit like what Vico did a couple of centuries earlier on, is that he developed an idea of communism, which was not imminent in the categories that he evolved, but it was a way that he sought to reconcile what was a very difficult problem. I mean, Kant tried to resolve his problem with a categorical imperative, but you could almost argue that it's almost a bit of an afterthought that you kind of try to close shop with. Right? I mean, you do that, I do it all the time. We kind of get so far with an idea, and then, how do we tie this up? And if you're a Slav like I am, you sometimes, write a couple of sentences and hope it will make sense tomorrow, right? Even great thinkers do that, but in a much more obviously sophisticated and elegant kind of a way. And it seems to me that what he failed to grasp, something that we understand now, is that history doesn't end. That history is continually in the process of becoming, and more importantly, something that we can see in the 21st century, is that in the very realization of the idea of freedom, we actually undermine the suppositions and the premises on which that original freedom was built. And the interesting thing about freedom, the good side and the bad side, because the two are inseparable, freedom and necessity do go hand in hand. The interesting thing about freedom is in the very act of being free, and freedom does involve living freedom. It isn't just something that you kind of get as a gift. It's not a right that you, in the very act of being free, you become aware of a new world where your freedom is contingent. In other words, the act of freedom creates the destruction of what had gone, the certainties that had gone on beforehand. And that's something that we become very, very sensitive to, which is that the freer we are, the more we take control of our destiny, the more things seem to be uncertain, beyond our grasp. And it's this impossibility of living with that uncertainty of even embracing that uncertainty, of taking pleasure out of that uncertainty. It is that which has meant that today the idea of freedom and liberty is so devalued and is so stigmatized. But for so many people, real freedom and real liberty no longer means very much. Because in the very act of intuiting what freedom is, we become aware of all the uncertainties and all the confusions and the difficulties that come along with that. To me, that's the human experience. It's something that we should embrace, enjoy, even desire, rather than be repelled by it. But that's another story for another lecture.
Okay, we've got a bit more than half an hour, so I'll come straight out for questions and comments. Show of hands, please. Okay, Jeff's got a microphone. And Ellie at the front. Keep your hands up so I can see.
Is that on?
Yeah.
When I asked Frank if Marx had ever said anything on social Darwinism, is that on?
Yeah.
No.
It's not on.
That's on. Blowing it. Technical solution. Make the microphone work. Can you hear me if I just speak?
Well, come up here.
Use the mic.
Go to the
Helen's okay. She knows.
Mine is.
Look, I'll just talk while you're moving that.
Yeah.
Okay, might be flat. Anyway, when I asked Frank if Marx had anything to say on social Darwinism, the recommendation was for me to read Engels' Anti-Dühring, which if people did want to follow up on it, actually is a really fantastic read and makes some very interesting points about the times. What I wanted to ask about was some of the points that you made about sociology. I thought your comments on the contribution of sociology to, on the one hand, contesting the idea of free will and the individual, and on the other, the significance of politics, are really, really important insights. And for those of us who are interested in sociology and social theory, I think makes a very important starting point in terms of rethinking the discipline, what it was about, what it's done, and what the idea of the social constitutes. And I think it is important thinking about the way things are now. If we think, for example, about the role of social science in creating evidence-based policy, I think you see the two problems of the attack on the individual and the problem of politics also both being posed to us. What I wanted to ask, though, thinking about early sociology, or for example, Durkheim, Weber and so on, if it would be right to think of what they were trying to do as well as a response to the perceived problem of the individual, also if in some sense they were reacting to Marx himself, and if their ideas constituted in some sense a direct or indirect reflection of Marx, and in particular its temporality and historical specificity, and whether that was true of what they were doing at the time.
Okay, there's Alka towards the back.
Right, so just shout, yeah?
Say so.
Oh, okay. The social, in fact, you made explicit something that we talked about at Easter with the parents thing.
Speak up.
Whether the social has been, I mean, certainly today you can see all the how negative it is and how suppressive it is of the individual and subjectivity and agency. But the way you posed it just now, is it just that it made it sound like it was a sort of ideological ordering mechanism and just that, whereas is there not, I'm not trying to replay it in the positive way today, but just to understand that how it could have, did it have a positive kernel at one time in that the social represented, if you like, an accumulative potential of individuals, of lots of individual subjectivities that were brought together and could create something really big and more powerful than just the individual on their own. That's how I had understood the social in a positive way in the past, and that today something's happened where that no longer exists and it's become much more conflated and suppressive agency. And the other question related to that is order antithetical to freedom? Do you not need order as well in some way? And there was something else, but I've forgotten that now to the main two.
Okay, I'll say Alan and Sabina, and if I don't know your name, just keep it on that one.
Is it still not working? A very crude endorsement of what Frank's been saying about the concept of the social, using some examples from China. About 18 months ago, I was at a conference in Shanghai, and one of the leading town planners in Shanghai made the point that the problem with Chinese planning is that they haven't reintroduced sociology into it. And I thought, well, this is good, because mostly sociology is either ethnography or positivism in China. But what he effectively meant was social engineering. And then 6 months after that, the 12th five-year plan came out, and the key concept in the 12th five-year plan is social management, which in Chinese terms means everything from coercion to welfare. And then I was asked to do some lectures at the party school in Shanghai, and I crudely came to the same conclusion that you did, Frank, is that, and then, Ellie, I said, all sociology is a response to Marx. It's to take politics out. And of course it works in China because China was over-politicized. So everybody is happy not to have politics at the moment. But what effectively it does is that sociology and the social management as it's understood is an effective way of pretending, a la Durkheim, that everything is consensual rather than conflict-based. It's a way of understanding things which are in order to generate consensus as opposed to the idea of conflict. And well, the way I understand that now, and it's in the most degraded form, is if you think of the idea of the big society. The big society is very easily criticisable in the way that the left does it, as an excuse for cuts. But in fact, it's a reintroduction of the idea of community, using the term society in the Burkean sense, in which the community can have no conflict within it, because communities agree on everything. Yeah? So if you take that into the context of real discussions, for example, in a primary school, everybody can agree to raise money for the school fete, but as soon as you introduce a question which divides people because of their interest, that's political. Except, of course, you're not allowed to do that because the school must have a fair trade policy. Yeah? My response to this in my school environment is to tell the headmistress, why are you introducing petty bourgeois economics into the school curriculum? Why don't you just teach them to read? And what's your position on immigration control? But that didn't go down very well.
Okay, I'll take Sabina and then I'll back to Clark.
Yeah, I have just one question, which is taking absolutely in agreement what you said about the concept of the social as a kind of reaction against the perceived threat of individualism, etc. Nonetheless, can't it be said, if you use a different category, the collective, that does play a role in the post-Enlightenment, justifiably play a role in the post-Enlightenment era as an understanding that people do not, though they are meant to act as subjects, they do not necessarily do so purely as individuals, but they also do it as collectives, which is, in fact, a new development, completely unheard of before, which evolves in progressive politics of the turn of the 18th to the 19th century.
Yeah, I think it's very important not to take the polar distinction between social and political too far, and not to just simply take concepts according to their own logic, because then there's a danger of giving it a meaning that is illegitimate. So the way that I see it myself is that what I'm saying about the social is pertinent from the standpoint, from the vantage point of today, in terms of, because we learn about the meaning of concepts through time. And that's one of the great things about historical thinking, is that concepts Yesterday somebody said about the Shakespearean play that it meant something very different in Shakespeare's time than it does now. It does, but actually, our understanding of Shakespearean characters today is probably more interesting than, because we have all that human experience that stays with us, than their interpretation was. And similarly with concepts. I mean, through time, concepts are almost like, it's like distilled, and you can get a clarity from seeing, just precisely, what human experience it captured. Now, my position on social is very one-sided at the moment, but I recognize that in different circumstances, you bend the stick in a different direction. So if you begin with a very famous episode in English politics, when Margaret Thatcher was supposed to have said, there is no such thing as society, which wasn't exactly what she said, do you remember the reaction against her? And ever since then, whenever you want to attack the Tories, you say, this party doesn't believe in society, and that's it, automatically. No more needs to be said. But actually, when you look at what Margaret Thatcher said about there is no such thing as society, she was much more correct than her critics, who basically said there's no such thing as individuals. That's basically what they were arguing. And I think that confused discussion that occurs at that particular time, sort of overlooks that the historical amnesia at work, overlooks the fact that the concept of society, undergoes very different definitions. It's got a healthy beginning. The concept of society has got a very healthy beginning in it's first raised in miniature in Republican Italy. They begin to talk about it in ways that are, that kind of will have the connotations of what civil society will have much later on for sort of Scottish moral theory and classical political economy. But at a certain point, society becomes a weapon with which to try to undermine and stigmatize the idea of individual choice, of individual agency, of individual autonomy. That's really what it becomes. And therefore, the argument that's used by a lot of left-wing sociologists to say that these people are reacting against Marx is wrong, actually. It's not totally wrong. It's wrong in one sense, that these criticisms first emerged even before Marx puts pen to paper. Because the earliest sociologists, the French ones, principally, Bonal, Demet, all these guys, are responding to Enlightenment thought. I mean, the guy they really hate, if there's one person that they really, really despise and hate, it is perversely Rousseau. They just cannot stand, and again, they misunderstand Rousseau. I don't like Rousseau either, but they really misunderstand him, because they think that Rousseau is an individualist. In fact, he isn't. Right? He's already is a very torn person at that point. But it's that they are all reacting to it. It's that kind of what they take to be the French Revolution's celebration of the individual. And it's only later on where what begins to occur is that the reaction to individualism, to the celebration of individualism, embraces the social, that you have this, the modern dialogue. And at that point, what happens is you do have a reaction. But what's interesting is, I don't know if any of you looked at these texts, but the reaction to Marx is again a silent conversation in the head. Because Durkheim almost never mentions, Weber never mentions Marx. They don't have a conversation with each other. Yet there are these allusions to economic determinism, to historical materialism. Here and there you find it, but there's no dialogue. Marx is not mentioned at all. And if you read Taft Parsons, who's like the father of modern American sociology, it's a self-conscious attack on Marx. Taft Parsons, I think, read the Communist Manifesto and a couple of, brief, sort of scientific. He never actually read Marx. So it's not a dialogue, but it's a reaction to, sort of something that is very different than what they are really reacting to. Now, is there anything healthy about the social? Well, insofar as any explanations that are individually based are one-sided and ultimately, sort of limited, you do need to have a conception of social relations, the relationship between people. But the way to conceptualize that is that there are, in fact, what we call impersonal forces at work. Right? Impersonal forces at work which acquire a power on their own accord, which need to be captured in thought and through concept. And therefore, it is that which needs to be. But what I take from Marx is not the social, but the historical. It's temporality that is really important. And I would end by saying that given the emphasis of the discussion today, it's really quite important to rehabilitate the standpoint of the individual. Because subjectivity, no matter how we conceptualize it, isn't just simply out there as a historical force. Subjectivity is real human beings, real individuals who possess the capacity to will to kind of pursue their history.
Okay, there's Daniel, Penny, and then Bruno, and I can see if you want.
Yeah, I wondered if you could revisit the concept of private property in the light of what you said in your speech, because I mean, certainly until I started doing reading for the Academy, I hadn't quite realised its centrality to political debates over the years, particularly in relation to freedom. So, for example, for the classical political economists you mentioned, obviously for them, private property was very centrally related to the idea of liberty, economic liberty. And then for Marx, as you discussed, it was related to the domination of one class over another. So, I mean, in today's circumstances, if you were to revisit the whole discussion of private property, what would be your take on it?
I know this is a misreading, but I'm just going to say it and then you can explain to me why I haven't quite understood it properly. But it almost felt as if what you were saying, Frank, was that the imagination of the conception of communism by Marx is a sort of is a shortcut. The projection into the future of the possibility of what this new society might be is a sort of it's his laziness, or it's not his laziness, but it's his attempt to concretize something, which actually at the point that he concretizes it seems justifiable, but maybe in retrospect is problematic. So are you sort of arguing that Marx's projection of communism is his own end of history, is the equivalent to Hegel's end of history? If so, the thing that I find difficult to understand as somebody that would identify myself as a communist is that I always thought that there was an end of history, and that end of history came about because you resolved the contradiction which was key to capital, which is that labour was indirectly social, and that labour became social. And so that sort of an end of history didn't seem to be so problematic to me for Marx then, but I can see why people might think of it so now. When you talk about making the individual the key thing now, I can understand entirely what you're saying, but that doesn't negate the indirectly social question as Marx posed it. But very quickly, I mean, Arendt is the picture here, and I think that Arendt is quite useful in the way that she sort of said there's no such thing as man, the individual, there's men, but then she takes that indirectly social relationship and she says, well, that's just a biological function, really. She poses that social experience of man in society as being just sort of like the stuff you do in order to live, and then she poses the active, subjective part of mankind as the individual political sphere. So, I mean, is her picture up there because she goes one step further than Marx. Okay, but to me she was Hannah But I mean, she seemed very good, really, at doing after Marx, taking that idea of the social and placing it in a different sphere, and the individual as the more important active sphere.
Okay, after Bruno, Andrew Kalka and Jenny Cunningham, please be as succinct as you can. Bruno.
I guess my question or point is similar, but I want to put it slightly differently. I can see rereading Marx, and last October for the Battle of Ideas, I reread German ideology. one of the things that was very striking in it was the focus on the individual and the development of the individual in society, and the importance of the development of fully rounded individuals who are fully rounded through their subjectivity. And when you look at Marx's sort of forays into history, the individuals portrayed in those histories are very full-rounded. They are very individual. And as a writer and as a journalist, his pen portraits of individuals were good. So I mean, I really don't see the problem or a conflict between between the social and the individual, and a focus on the development of the individual is not necessarily or at all the same thing as individualism, of course. But my question then, I guess, becomes, what is the relationship, which is important in Marxism, between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom? You seem to be saying that in Marx's attempt to resolve the realm of freedom in communism, that he was taking a shortcut, and he seemed to be maybe saying that our place in history is a bit like the canted on the edge of the world, where we want to move from necessity to the realm of freedom, but perhaps there is no answer, perhaps there is no realm of freedom, just the constant search for it, or striving for it, or struggle for it. Is that what you're saying?
On being in time, to coin a phrase, but probably I won't be so long in saying it. At the time of the mercantile enlightenment, it seems to me, the quest for the best led to a new level of comparability between things, commensurability of ideas, commonality between people, which is to say that the subject at the periphery of his own experience and interests was nonetheless holding the centre, in the word we want to distance ourselves from, if you like, kind of the social. But at that position where the imperative is the commonality, is the best of what we have in common, is the best of what we commonly are. And in that sense, I put it the wrong way around. It's not so much the mercantile first, it's enlightenment first and mercantile second. Because that imperative, which is also the imperative to freedom, is not only in the mind, but it's of the mind. It is the expression in reality of developing human consciousness. And at that particular time, it has that temporality. But from the moment when capital stops being mercantile, and from the moment when it is capital that mobilizes human activity, then what occurs is that capital, this thing, this inhuman thing, this unconscious thing, is outrunning mind. It trumps consciousness. And it's at that point that capital becomes the condition not of our own choosing, and the condition, therefore, that our own choosing, our consciousness, has to address. And it seems, and that is of that time. But in this time, where we are, it seems to me we have a local dispensation from that urgent necessity. There is a place in this part of the world, in its way of being, where we are not bound so tightly by those conditions. But even our local dispensation is dependent on the continuation of that condition universally in the world as a totality. So it would seem to me that we've got to do it at both ends, haven't we? We have got to, yes, restate the role of the subjective in the imperative to freedom, but it's equally imperative that we continue to address that which remains the conditionality, the condition not of our consciousness, not of our choosing.
Okay, Jenny, and then yeah.
suppose one of the problems is that we use the term social quite uncritically as kind of a shorthand to oppose ideas of determinism. So, for example, today in opposing biological determinism, in terms of sort of human consciousness and human thought, you contrast that with the concept of the social, or the Gotskian idea that everything that we think, or our own self-consciousness, begins as a social phenomenon and is then incorporated into individual psyches or human thinking. And it's just that I think we all find that we use that shorthand without interrogating it, but we do use it for the purposes of trying to counteract some of the very deterministic theories that do prevail at the moment.
Frank, and then I'll take one more round.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a problem because we are to some extent conceptually impoverished at the moment for a variety of reasons. And the way around it, what I try to do is I always try to remember that all concepts that are rigorous have a counterpoint to them somewhere. Right? So, for example, the idea of freedom immediately invites a counter idea, necessity. Or the idea of freedom can invite the idea of authority. There's always a counter, similarly with social. And the problem with the term social isn't that there's anything wrong with the social as such, in and of itself. It's when the social is the polar opposite, or seen as the polar opposite to the individual. Right? That's really when you run into trouble. And I think it is this usage, rather than the fact that there is a domain of the social, which are the interconnections between human beings, and the way that's kind of recast in institutions and organizations. Also, those things do exist, but it's what we counterpose the concepts to. The concept I have most difficulty with, as it happens, is not really the social, but necessity. Because I think that in the way that in the 19th century necessity was formulated, I don't want to go into it a lot because I'm going to talk about it just to start, but the way that it was formulated in the 19th century was very much in material terms. So that, if you look at Marx's writings, freedom is sort of conceptualized as freedom from necessity. It's when you overcome the realm of necessity, you move into the realm of freedom, which there's nothing really wrong with that as such. It's only a problem if that becomes the be-all and the end-all, if that relationship is seen as very much in its own term. Whereas I think that what we've learned since the 19th century, because we had a phenomenal amount of experience that really hasn't been digested. We have these shortcuts that we take. We use terms like postmodern and all the rest of that kind of avoid looking into the human experience in any kind of detail. The thing that we've learned is that freedom isn't just freedom from necessity. It isn't just a from, or, it's not, freedom isn't just simply to do with the neutralization of material needs. Because if we do that, then we end up with the Cameron government's happiness unit. That we already have too much prosperity and all the rest of that. Freedom itself, that's the buzz. Freedom itself creates, sort of its own problems. In the very act of, and the more powerful we are as human beings, the more we are in control of our destiny, the more we set into motion forces that have a power over us. That's what's happening in the 19th. The power out there hasn't decreased, and for a lot of people, that's horrible. That is seen as like apocalyptic. That is seen as all the stuff that we worried about, whether we call it climate change, whether we call it globalization, and all the things that we talk about as being big problems, are really the forces that are set in motion through the acts of human agents making their own way. What I'm proposing is, instead of seeing that as a problem, as a bad thing, it is actually an indication of our human potential And it's something that we need to conceptualize in a different way than in the 19th century relationship between freedom and necessity. There's a positive element there that will reoccur and reoccur, which is why I think in the end, there is no end to history, and that's a good thing. I actually think that the fact there isn't an end to history should make us feel much more attuned to our own humanity. Somebody, what's his name, used the concept being the edge of the world. Scruton talked about the edge of the world. That's actually the place we should really be at. That's far more exciting to be at the edge of the world than in the thick of it. It is a far more creative place to engage with reality. And instead of drawing back from it, we should think about it as a place that we want our communities to be built upon, rather than in boring old, ultimately futile certainties.
Okay, Alan, Phoenix, Joe, Ben.
Well, there might not be an end of history, but there could be an end of freedom and an unfreedom. I want to come back to that because I'm just slightly confused because I can understand the desire to rehabilitate the individual, specifically now because it's been so downgraded. But one wouldn't want to necessarily abolish the social, which obviously has a relationship between the individual and the social, as Marx talks about perhaps as commodities engaging in one another, which objectively still happens. So there's that fluid relationship between the two, although perhaps crassly has been represented as being all the social today, and one would want to kind of rescue that a bit more intellectually. It strikes me that, when I was at university, everyone accused, as you pointed out very well, but everyone accused Marx of being tautological, and it also seemed to me that whether you did philosophy or economics or history, it was all an attempt to sanitize and separate what was previously political economy. But the thing that I'm confused about is this discussion about everything continually becoming. So there may not be an end to history, human history, certainly. It may just be a beginning to history, but freedom is a political category as we understand it. The context of human freedom that is dominated and shaped by the very particular kind of relationships that we have, that has been a continuation of previous types of societies up until our own. Not so much a shortcut that Marx wanted to say, and obviously there was a political element, there was a propagandistic element, but my understanding of it, once you abolish those particular type of relationships, you abolish the unfreedom that exists. So both freedom and unfreedom, and the way we understand it, gets abolished. So it is possible to do that. Now then, humanity may decide that it wants to redefine freedom in a new way, whether it's we can all have space travel or whatever, but that would dispense with it in the way that we understand it.
Okay, that's Felix.
I think the one aspect of this that I find most troubling in a way is sort of locating my attitude towards the individual. So on the one hand, we have almost, it seems like a romanticising of the individual and human agency and humanity. And there was a quote, I think it was from Albion Small, if I recorded his name correctly, where he said social theory in modern form reminds us of human limitations, and this was a bad thing, this sort of jettisons agency to providence to external forces, etc. But I mean, I would posit that is all sociology based on a reaction to human limitations. I have a somewhat emotive example, but I did some volunteering for a charity called Dignify over the summer, which deals with abuse of elderly people, and it uses government legislation, evidence-based research to kind of collect all this data and sort of suggest ways of resolving it. And without going into details, it was appalling. It was really kind of a turning point in my thinking. And it just reminds me today of Freud and civilization is content. I know Freud's not particularly fashionable now because he could argue that sort of the emphasis on the unconscious and these kind of animal desires that we have to try and suppress is just another form of providence in a way. It's just it's going in instead of something external. Could you not say that the accommodation of the social and the individual, and in a way you touched upon this when you said that there shouldn't be seen as polar opposites, but can you not argue that the social is a contract that is imposed on the individual, which will protect the individual, but at the same time, the individual is stopped from really sort of exercising their drives of the id and things like that. So my question is, I guess, I mean, at least post-Freud, should the limitations on the individual and sort of the darker aspect of humanity not be underestimated? Or, you know, should it not even be foregrounded?
Okay, thanks. So Joe, Ben, John Fitzpatrick, no more than a minute each was right.
This is a very, very quick question, but I'm just wondering what you would see as the differences or the relationship between the social and Habermas's concept of the public sphere.
That's a rhetorical question. Communism in our lifetime. Answer, please. Number one. Two, just an extension from Penny. It did seem as if you were saying communism as the objective is kind of, we're moving that out a bit, and that your thinking has developed. So could you sort of answer, is it the objective, whose lifetime?
Okay, John, then Laura at the back, and I think that'll have to be it.
I've always been a rather vulgar Marxist myself, and mostly on the grounds that a bit of vulgarity is often necessary in dealing with these matters. Communism in our lifetime, who knows? I have absolutely no idea, and I hope nobody here does either have any idea. One of the important insights I got in my political development and understanding was from Lukács, when he was writing about German philosophy, and he said freedom, as the German philosophers realized, is something practical. It is an activity. And I think that's the essential point here, is that Marx didn't lose sight. I don't think there was anything unbalanced at all in Marx, as Jakubowski emphasizes in his formulations about, you know, it's not consciousness that determines being, it's social being or social existence that determines consciousness. As Jakubowski said, Marx understood very well. He wasn't talking about the economy or materialism in some sort of crude sense. He was talking about the way in which people live together in the process of living with each other and pursuing their existence together. And that, of course, embraces everything, you know, about that existence. And that itself builds upon the insight in his thesis on Feuerbach about how the essence of humanity resides in the ensemble, the matrix of human relationships. We are constituted in who we are and what we do. And freedom is something practical in those terms. It's about how we intervene. And Marx didn't project forward in that sense. He projected forward only in a rather limited, it's a question of scale here. That he did say, you know, the integument would be burst asunder, that the proletariat would be the grave digger of this particular system. In those matters, that's often what the accusations of prophecy are directed at. In any wider sense, he didn't project forward, I don't think, about, you know, communism into the future. He was always very careful. You know, the content goes beyond the phrase, he said, of the future in the 18th Brumaire. We don't know what that will be like. You know, and there are sketches and there are a few hints here and there. He is talking always about what you do. I mean, Bruner talked about the German ideology. He said, he defines what is a communist? A communist is somebody who opposes the present state of things, who wants to abolish the present state of things that holds us back. And you know, that's what freedom is, nothing more than the understanding that we can do better, that we are held back, and that there's something that we can do about it.
Okay, Laura, Joe, then Frank, that's it.
Okay, I just wondered what you thought about whether communism is a valid concept in our lifetime when we look at Fukuyama and his essay that he thinks that, you know, the end of history is what we have in Western liberal democracy.
Question to go back to the some of these determinants, which, as you suggested, are not causal, but nonetheless there, and about the concept or the role of the transformation of nature in creating possibilities for progress. It goes back to the point about necessity, perhaps, but it seems clear to me that in relation both to say, Hegel's notion of the development of an idea or contemporary notion of social constructionism. Within Marx, you have the category of labour and the transformation of nature as a kind of very powerful way into understanding the expansion, at least of the possibilities of human freedom. So were your last remarks suggesting that we've kind of already got there in terms of our capacity to transform nature. I mean, it's a case to be made that, we produce enough food for everyone in the world in a way that we clearly didn't in kind of 1870 or 1900. I would suggest that's not the case, and there's still a kind of limitation on the possibilities for freedom arising from the capacity of human beings to transform the natural world. So, which, as I say, I think is relevant to economics or the question of economics in a way that goes beyond perhaps the kind of way that economics is understood today. So, any response to that?
Sorry, we're already over time.
No, I think we should extend the session. Because it's just
I'm sorry,
it's
we can't do
so
that.
big.
We already changed things
The
around.
topics are really big. I think it should be.
It is, I'm sorry.
I think we should vote on this.
Yeah, I mean, it is a pity because I think especially the last set of each question are really very important ones to think about. I think there are two ideas of freedom in Marx. There's the idea that John talked about, which is the one I agree with, which is freedom as action. Freedom that's related to praxis, kind of conscious activity. And the other idea of freedom in Marx is the one that you talk about, which is freedom in relation to necessity. And I do think there's a tension between those two ideas of freedom that are never resolved, and it's impossible to resolve by any one individual. It's not that he's not a clever guy and he didn't understand it, but that is a difficult one to resolve. And I think that my resolution to the problem is influenced by what happened in the last 150 years and the experience that you kind of distill from that point onwards. And it seems to me that sort of how you see freedom now is much more in the way that John talks about it, the way that he particularly in the early Marx, where it has a much more voluntaristic side to it than than later on. Not because one wants to necessarily opt for voluntarism, but for the very, very simple reason that today, when certain concepts are used, there's a very clear agenda behind it. So, I try to suggest that the way we use terms is contingent on the present. We shouldn't delude ourselves to kind of making this into a meta-historical idea that's true for all times. In other words, when I hear almost everything being explained as being the fault of society, right? It's not my fault, it's society. It's society this and that. If society becomes this all-purpose explanation for everything, good or bad, then I think we're obliged to interrogate this very flattening out of human experience, this very deterministic way, which really is the end of freedom. Because if it's society that is to blame, then our freedom to choose is really, really very limited. And I know this because I've done a series of debates all over Europe on freedom. And the number of times somebody comes along and says, "Oh, Frank, you just believe in, sort of this kind of, but there's, what does freedom mean when and they kind of quote Voltaire again and all the rest of that. That does lead to a situation where agency becomes entirely denuded of any real kind of content. I think it's in that kind of context, it's important to take this seriously. I think that's the context that we're talking about. So from that point of view, I would say that communism is a misconceived idea that Marx adopted, mainly because he was part of a big discussion searching for universalistic ways of regarding things. I think that universalism was very much part of the Enlightenment experience, the attempt to give universality kind of real meaning. He tried to give universality meaning through the agency, to the agency of the working class, as what he called the universal class. I think that is I would see that as being slightly external to his theory, that he's trying to kind of grapple with. He's trying to find a mediation to which the relation between particularity and universality are resolved. And I think, experience shows us that if we take his own ideas seriously, which is that freedom is somehow related to activity, then it doesn't stop. I mean, freedom, contrary to what somebody else said over there, is not political. I mean, political freedom is one side of it. Freedom is much, much more than that, including a guy was talking about Freud over there. I mean, as it happens, Freud's are really important here. I mean, his ideas of the unconscious, and his ideas about intuition are almost a pre-political way of grasping towards many of the insights that political theorists like Marx themselves. I mean, consciousness, it's not something you can compartmentalize and extrapolate from the individual in the way that it's not kind of often seen. So all those things are really quite important for an idea of freedom as something that isn't given to us, isn't there for all time. Freedom, by its definition, if you understand freedom in a kind of way that is related to activity, is an ongoing process, and it is something that invites its opposite as well, unfortunately. I mean, it would be nice to say, now we're free, now we can put our foot up and that's it. But in the very act of gaining freedom, we become aware of the limits. And that I think is not something to worry about, but it's something to think about and make our own. And that's something we haven't done so far. Our reaction at the moment is to run away from that. That's the dominant Western reaction, is a flight from freedom. So that's really what we're doing, and we should really try to reverse that trajectory. And on Fukuyama, I mean, Fukuyama is interesting because Fukuyama is a caricatured version of Hegel. I mean, Hegel can be excused for saying that. He's living in Prussia. He just had an experience of Napoleon kicking the ass of the Germans. He wants to create this state, so you can understand why he ends up where he does. But for Fukuyama to describe the American empire as having the historical equivalent of the Prussian state is a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, we see what goes in America now, and if that's the end of history, then all I can say that, as I said in a debate with him, history has just begun. I mean, that's the thing. We only now realize that history, contrary to all the prejudice, is only now beginning. Only now are you and I are in a position to begin to become proper historical agents.
Okay, Frank, if you're willing, Jeff says we can have 10 more minutes. So are you happy to take more questions?
Yeah, I'll hear what people are saying.
Okay, Mina?
Okay, I think Frank has introduced loads of very interesting ways of thinking forward. But like John, I'm also a bit of a crude Marxist, and I just want to go back to this economic determinism question. And I kept thinking why we had Rosa Luxemburg up there. And perhaps it had something to do with his understanding of monopoly capitalism, etc., which was a bit deterministic. But I remember the days when we had educationals where we would say, capitalism is going to collapse of necessity. There was a sort of a necessary, logical imperative, a law, logical law that capitalism was going to collapse and how we're going to respond to that. And I would say that these things are just as important to maintain and remember as they were then. I mean, when we look at the inexorable tendency of capitalism to crisis, etc., these are things that we shouldn't kind of forget about. And one of the readings said that, look at religion. Religion was there, in primitive times. There wasn't an economy then. So how could you have economy determining things? And I think that economy shouldn't be understood in this sort of narrow, flat way. Yeah, there were no factories then, but there was the struggle of man with nature. And it's man's struggle with nature that kind of determined a lot of things and how history progressed. So in the broad sense, I think I just want to make a defense of economic determinism.
Okay, Stuart, Jacob, Bruno.
Yeah, well, I can appreciate people's attempt to defend communism here. I didn't think I'd have a discussion like this at one of these sessions where this sort of thing appeared. Just simply in the terms of you imagine we appreciate that capitalism is not the greatest economic system in the world and has problems. Therefore, there must be something that means that you have something after it. But then you find a difficult situation. I was in Newcastle just 2 days ago before I came here, and I'm having a discussion with my mate. It was never a communist in the past, but is now a communist. He says that I've sold out because I'm no longer a communist. And in essence, the reason he is now demanding communism is because he wants some sort of restraint on the greed of individuals. That's basically what he's talking about. So he is promoting himself now in a peculiar way as a radical communist because he hates people. But in essence, he hates people, he doesn't trust them, and he wants to limit their freedom. That's why he is now arguing for
I think it's interesting that Fukuyama's come up again, because, as I say again, but he always seems to come up, that I think he's just mistaken a problem for a solution. And what I think is really interesting in Fukuyama is that when we think about this process, these processes driven by human agency that we're talking about, that's how history happens, right? That has always presupposed that very human agency. And what Fukuyama identifies and he sees as sometimes he sees it as a great thing, and sometimes he's incredibly pessimistic about it, is that this sort of sense of human agency and the belief you have to have in human agency seems to have been exhausted and come to an end. And then you have what is the end of history without this presupposition of human agency. You have a time where historical processes, as understood as being driven by human agencies, they just stop happening. And you do have and then he sometimes seems to get a bit pessimistic about it, the perpetual caretaking of the Museum of Human History. If that's the end of history, that's not like a triumphant announcement, is it? That's like a incredibly deep and pessimistic thing about the fact that agencies stop working on the world and thus history stopped.
Bruno?
I think Stuart's completely right in terms of communism. If you look at the practice of the communists in their sort of heroic era, it's about democracy. It's about the realisation of the practical activity of freedom. I guess my problem is, Frank, I don't really agree with your portrayal as a realm of necessity, as one of material necessity, i.e. some kind of scarcity, poverty, that kind of thing. I mean, I do think it's very clear, in Marx all the way through, certainly at the beginning in German ideology, that the realm of necessity is the realm of compulsion, where social relations are objectified and confront human beings as compulsion, rather than relations between people. And he wanted to humanise that, or humanise men's real true relations between each other, and that's why he wanted to go beyond from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. Now, I'm not arguing that that's necessarily realisable, and perhaps it's better to stand on the cusp of the tensions between those two things in terms of practice and thought. But I do think it's quite important that that's actually Marx. For me, Marx's real insight that it's not necessity, isn't material in some sort of really economic determinist kind of way. It's about how the relations between human beings have come to confront and dominate them at a moment when actually world history was opening up these huge possibilities.
Okay, Kevin, Helen, and Sabina, I think that will be it.
Yeah, I have a question. It's just, you mentioned, Frank, the whole issue of meaning and how the meaning of history is very, very important. And I just wonder whether you could say something about the relationship of freedom and meaning, because it strikes me that freedom breeds a sort of uncertainty that erodes meaning, which in turn, in some ways, freedom is built upon meaning. The fact that we're not always reinventing the wheel is something because we inherit a past tradition, and yet because it's constantly eroding that past tradition, how does that work itself out?
just from back here, I don't think anyone ever said that in our tradition that the collapse of capitalism was inevitable. But
louder, please.
I don't think we've ever said that the collapse of capitalism was inevitable, but that wasn't what I was going to ask. But when you first spoke and you talked about communism being, you know, Marx kind of pushing the idea and trying to sort of find a resolution to the, you know, desire for freedom, I kind of thought you were saying that it was sort of just too prescriptive, almost kind of utopian, in that you're kind of imposing a kind of a desire for freedom into a kind of prescriptive mechanism, which obviously isn't how history works itself out. But then when you talked just now and you came back and you said that, in fact, the whole notion of agency was wrong in terms of the sort of the universal kind of properties of the working class. I'd like you to expand on that a bit more, because I'm not that bothered about what you say about society, but I think the fact that the collective individual interests of the proletariat was understood in a particular way, you're now saying that probably was pushing things too far. I'd just like you to explain that a bit more.
Okay, Sabine, anyone final takers? No.
Well, I actually had the same question. I mean, when you were saying this thing about communism was a sort of misconceived conceptualization of trying to link the universal and the specific. Did you mean that to say, or maybe you can just explain it again.
Okay, John, and then
I just think that I'd like you to be a bit sum up in a slightly more optimistic and positive fashion, please. And I also like to correct this talk about how you're talking about the end of history. I don't think Marx was talking. Marx's idea about communism was also about it being at the end of history, but about it being the beginning of history, and that as long as we're constrained by necessity, then we're just talking about human prehistory. It's only when we actually can get rid of all the constraints of how our social relations are seen as things outside ourselves, and we don't have control of how we produce things, etc. Until we can get away from the constraints of material necessity. When we get away from the constraints of material necessity, that's when we have the beginning of history and the beginning of real freedom, when human beings can have different problems, and freedom would create its own problems, but it's a positive and much more exciting future than the idea that this, you know, it has its own problem. Can you be a bit more? I want some aspiration, some ambition, and some things to dream for, not the end of history. It's just wrong.
Okay, Frank, we're now going to something to dream about.
I always thought my specialty was nightmares. But I actually thought what I said was pretty optimistic, because what I'm really arguing is that uncertainty, that is the price of freedom, is actually an intensely desirable and interesting experience. And I think that's, you know, I find that, you know, I mean, I don't know about you, but when you have in your own life things that are very predictable, routines, I mean, can be a little bit tedious. You know, that's why we strive for experiences that go beyond, you know, the norm and maybe even a little bit edgy. And it seems to me that, you know, what I'm really arguing, and I'm trying to be, don't misunderstand hopefully what I'm saying. I'm talking about this argument that I'm putting for now. And I'm talking about addressing problems that we now know that in the 19th century people couldn't have known, that only becomes crystallized through the process of modern capitalist development, that gives us a sensibility that, you know, we're privileged to have access to, that other generations before us could not have had sort of done. And I think that's really, you know, the way to kind of say it. And just to go back to a few of the questions, I mean, I agree with Bruno there that necessity isn't just material. I think it was Bruno that said that, but it involves an element of compulsion. My argument is that freedom creates its own compulsion. And that's something that we cannot get away from. And I'm also arguing that the very fact that we're compelled to do things is what gives our freedom meaning. In other words, why would one try to be free if everything was okay, perfectly all right, if there was no tension within within the air. I mean, freedom would have no meaning under those circumstances. It would be just life. And it's precisely because freedom itself creates its own, invites its own compelling opposites that we need to perhaps have a more sophisticated understanding that we can now have that wasn't possible in the 19th century, because we now know that every time we invent something, every time we innovate, every time we create the internet or anything else, we set in motion forces, that create new problems for us. Now, you can do as we do today and pathologize those problems. So you can say that, oh, internet, it's about internet bullying, internet pedophiles, it's about trolls in the internet, it's about all the, whatever they call them, all these horrible things, the dark side of the internet. Or you can say, as I do, that I can sit on my ass at home, never have to go to the library, and I can just do, I can just use the internet, to kind of do stuff. And it's a wonderful way of communicating and interacting and all the rest of that. So you can, those two visions are possible for us about everything. But of course, the element of compulsion is there, and then there are huge problems that can also emerge along with it. Now, what I'm arguing is that the big problem that's happened is that because of the challenge that our development as human beings poses for us, we have become very uncomfortable with the pursuit of freedom. And the pursuit of freedom takes many forms. I take truth-seeking to be a very important element. The freedom to seek the truth. Feeling free to seek the truth. I mean, all those things are really quite important. And all the activities that one associates with freedom as an activity, sort of are sneered upon. So we not just simply have, as somebody was suggesting, Fukuyama, end of history. I mean, Fukuyama is actually a much more interesting character than all the other people. At least he thinks and he kind of writes about it. But we even have the end of the author. I mean, just count on the number of ends we now have. But everything is at an end. I mean, who needs apocalyptic religious fanatics at the end of the world when everything is at an end? And basically, what these reactions really represent is an estrangement from freedom, precisely because, as somebody suggested, I think it was Kevin, freedom is linked to meaning. And in the very act of being free, we call meaning into question. And that's what has happened. That the freer we are, the more choices that we make, the more the meaning that gave rise to freedom in the first place evaporates. And that's been, the religious freedom, the desire on the part of Protestants to be free, turns their religion on its head, because at a certain point, it leads to a reaction to the religious ideals that gave rise to it in the first place. So, we're always in the business of freeing ourselves from the meaning that we imposed upon our life beforehand. Now, a lot of conservative thinkers see that as a problem, the classical meaning and whatever. What does it all mean? But actually, what is a problem is an opportunity for us to have the freedom to give meaning to our experience. We don't do it abstractly, without regard to what has gone on beforehand. We can take that with us. But it does give us that kind of possibility. I just want to end on, I agree with Helen that Marx never talks about the collapse of capital in that sense. He's got a tendential analysis where there are countervailing tendencies that work. One of them is a tendency towards the falling rate of profit, which is counteracted by a number of other tendencies. Rosa Luxemburg does have a theory of capitalist collapse. But I've got no idea why she's... she was a smart woman and a brave, brave woman as well to put herself on the line. And she paid, with her life for it. But her theory is a little bit simplistic. It's not an example of, subtle, sort of dialectical thinking. But so it was a tendential analysis. Now, the really big question that people are asking towards the end, which I'm not going to give you a satisfactory answer for, but you can read my next book on it, is about universalism. And that's a concept I've got most amount of problems with, because you will know that ever since the Greek times, there's been this search for an abstract universal. And people have tried to give their culture, their experience, a universal validity. When the Romans did that, it was a universal empire. And Christianity claimed to be a universal religion. And in the Middle Ages, in medieval times, they desperately built these universal Roman empires to kind of give meaning to that. And in a sense, I would say that the aspiration towards universality is a very human quality that we have, but something that we have not yet captured in thought. I think that's one of the interesting intellectual challenges for the new generations. How you capture universality in thought. That is something that we failed to do so far. I think Marx himself didn't succeed, but that does remain a challenge, and it may well be the case that in the course of attempting to solve that challenge, we realize there's no need for that. That we've gone beyond, there's no need for universality because it may well be a kind of false form of reassuring ourselves that we're all the same.